It really struck me today when we heard, in fact, the apostle reading. That apostle reading made me think back beyond our life, to the beginning of faith in these islands. We're very lucky in as much as we have relics of St. Alban, the protomartyr of Britain, in this city, in the Oratory Church, where we will venerate those relics next week. And down the road, just outside Newport in Caerleon, we have the site where Saints Julius and Aaron possibly were not martyred, but where they struggled as Roman Christians. Holiness in these isles goes back so far. It goes back, of course, many hundreds of years before the baptism of Rus, before St. Vladimir. We go back to the end of Roman Britain, where people are shedding their own blood for the confession of the Christian faith. So what we heard in the apostle today is something that very much sums up that period of early Christianity, in which faith was dangerous, in a life in which you said, I am a Christian, was not only dangerous, but deadly, because you would pay possibly the price for this confession with your own lives and with your blood. And so we go back right into that early period, and then we look through the centuries that follow. And we see so many sorts of holiness, just as we have said with all of the saints of Rus, just as we can say of all of the saints who shone forth in Byzantium, in the lands of the Byzantine Empire. Yet again we come back to this diversity of people. And I think we need to remember that across those centuries, life was so different. To think that those first martyrs were Romans. They were Roman citizens. They had been schooled in the pagan tradition of the philosophers. They came to Christ from paganism. They came from the sort of background that we remember for St. Vladimir and St. Olga. They worshipped foreign and strange gods, who were not gods, but demons. And they came into the light of Christ. And that light of Christ shone through their lives. And that light was so great that others were touched and converted by the very fact that they had Christ in their hearts and his light in their lives. To remind those of you who have forgotten, and to instruct those who do not know, St. Alban, the first martyr, he never reached baptism. He could not be baptized before he was martyred. His baptism was in his own blood. We call it the baptism of blood. Of course we call it the baptism of desire, but it was that baptism of blood. But how did St. Alban come to faith? He came to faith by seeing the wonderful, light-filled life of the priest that he was hiding. It was so wonderful. St. Amphibalus. This man is the one who really touched Alban with the light of Christ. And that's one thing I want you all to remember, that Christ touches other people and enlightens their lives with his light through us, through people. When we come to Orthodox bishops, the saints, we call them enlighteners. Some, such as St. Gregory the Enlightener in Armenia, are known as the Enlightener. We talk about St. Kirill, St. Cyril, and St. Methodius as the enlighteners of the Slavs. They who brought light to where there was darkness. Light was brought into St. Alban's life by somebody else. And then those who stood around also received the light of Christ by seeing the confession of faith. Think of the 40 martyrs of Sebaste. One of those Roman soldiers gave in, and he was tempted out of the freezing lake in which the Christian soldiers were being frozen to death. And what happened? One of those who was standing nearby said, "I will take his place." He was so touched and he was so moved by the faith of these men, Roman citizens, Roman soldiers who preferred to die for truth, that he said, "My lot is with them. I will take the place of this man." The light had been passed on, and the light in these isles was passed on. And sometimes, if we look in the history of these islands, as in the history of the Slav world, sometimes it was very, very dark. And yet in all of this darkness, there were these little pinpricks of light. Think of the age in which the yet unconverted Saxons, the Germanic tribes, were raiding Britain. They were burning monasteries. They were taking people as slaves. They were slaying whole villages of people. They were killing the monks. They were robbing the monasteries. If it wasn't them, it was the Vikings. And life was violent and life was dark. And Christianity was dangerous. This time, why? Because pagan tribes from the continent sought to destroy it. And yet the light shone through. And we remember the light in so many of the names that we meet. And when Europe began to forget about Christianity, what happened? From these islands, men went on to the continent. Men went to Europe to preach the gospel. And Irish saints appear in all sorts of places. Irish saints, Irish monks appeared in Kiev. English monks later on would be in Constantinople. Across the world, in France, in Switzerland, in Italy, the saints went from these islands and they founded monasteries and they preached the gospel. They even, in some places, left their gospel books, and these ancient gospel books are still there, a testimony to the men who went from Britain to preach the gospel and to take the light of Christ. And this is sometimes forgotten. How different it is, and it strikes me to now, the fact that at one time, in the darkness of paganism, the darkness in which God was forgotten, that Britain should be a beacon, that from Britain the light of the gospel should go, and that fires of faith that were nearly going out on the continent were kindled again by the light which was taken from these isles, from places like Glastonbury, places like Llanil Tidfawr, Llantwit, on our own doorstep, from Bangor, and from Iona, from Lindisfarne, from the Irish monasteries. These were holy isles. How different it seems now. How different that these islands that sent faith to everywhere else are now in darkness. And yet, what do we have all around us, particularly in this our part of the world? We have holy wells, we have religious sites, we have sacred places. I don't know how many holy wells alone there are in Wales, no idea. But we're talking probably over 1,000. How many places in Wales beginning with that prefix Llan, which show that this is a monastic holy place? All of these places, they are still there. People may have forgotten their significance. And then that puts the ball in our court. Children have heard the names They can reel off names like St. David and St. Non. They know of possibly St. Melangel. They know of their local saints, perhaps St. Taylo, St. Dyfrig. But perhaps they can't tell you anything. If we went to Barry and asked people, what can you tell us about St. Barog? Could they tell you anything? We may have a nice surprise. And in fact, probably more would know something than we thought. But we can go as educators. You can go as educators. And when I say you, I'm not just talking to those here who are Celts or Anglo-Saxons or a mixture of the both. All of us. What was really striking was that over 100 years ago, His Beatitude Metropolitan Antony of Kiev and Galich, who was the first hierarch of the Russian Church in exile, went on a pilgrimage. And he went on a pilgrimage to St. David's. This man, who was one of the most important and eminent and certainly holiest men in the Russian Church, should take the steam train and he should head out of London, through England, and into Wales. And that he, an elderly Russian bishop, should go to St. David's shrine. And that he should kneel down there and make a prostration and pray. And it strikes me, it's almost as though in him, the exiled church came to pay homage to the ancient saints of these isles, where so many Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians and Lithuanians and Latvians and people of the empire were given exile and were given a home. And he went, this child of St. Vladimir, this successor of, think of all the men whom he had succeeded on the throne of Kiev. Such eminent saints, those early saints, and the likes of St. Petromogila, great saints. He went and he paid homage. Later on, we had another great man. And St. John came and he built on that legacy. As bishop, as archbishop, he said to the exiled Russian Orthodox people, these are our saints. As I said last week, there's no such things as other people's saints and our saints. These are everybody's saints. And St. John, when he was in Paris, he started reading the lives of the ancient saints, particularly the French ones, the saints of Gaul. St. Martin of Tours, St. Gregory of Tours, St. Genevieve of Paris. And he told the Russian clergy and monastics, read their lives, translate their lives into Russian, write services for these saints, because they are ours. And they did. And on that legacy, we celebrate this feast. If St. John had have been based in London rather than Paris, perhaps the push would have been for St. David and for St. Taylo, for St. Melangel, for St. Bridget, for St. Patrick, and saints of these isles. But nevertheless, he showed this openness and this love for the saints of the West. And he said, these are the Orthodox saints of the West. As I say, that legacy has been built upon. And now we can go to so many places. We see icons of the Western saints. We have the services to the ancient Western saints. And that first time that we went to Llandaff Cathedral to venerate the relics of St. Taylo, as a sort of amusement, I thought, I'll just Google just in case, and typed in Russian, Troparion of St. Taylo, and then had the surprise, because ping, what appeared, the Troparion to St. Tailo in Church Slavonic, the Kontakion, the Kondak to St. Tailo in Church Slavonic. And it reminds us that people in Russia, people in Ukraine, and I know certainly people in Greece, are venerating the saints of these islands, and they are loving them. We had books on Welsh saints come back from Moscow, where we can read the lives of the saints of Wales in Russian. This is known, this is spread. And as I've said before, and I hope it's not boring to keep saying it again, let the saints tie us together. Let the saints unite us. Let the saints make us to be one. Before the creed, the deacon, of course, calls us to be one in mind and to be one in love. And that's what these saints call us to on this day. Their names are too many to enumerate. Here, of course, in Wales, for us, St. David is probably at the top of the hierarchy. His mother, St. Non, whose chapel marks the place where he was born on the cliff top in Pembrokeshire. St. Melangelth, whose relics are still there in Pennant Melangelth, still there for us to visit. Down the road, St. Gwynllw, St. Woolos, who of course had his cathedral, his monastery at least, in Newport. We remember the likes of St. Tailo and St. Dyfrig and St. Illtyd locally. The names go on. Some of them people have forgotten as saints. If you say to most people and mention the name Gladys, we know who they will picture. It's actually a nurse. Nurse Gladys Emanuel, of course. They will think of it. Or they will think of Heidi High. They will think of Gladys Pugh. They will think of Gladys as being an almost funny name of funny figures. And yet in St. Gladys, which of course is the Welsh for Claudia, we see a very great royal saint, the mother of saints, who brought up her children in holiness and sanctity. Let us all respond to these saints. Go and be curious. Go and look. Go and find their lives. You can find them in Russian. Go and find their hymns. You can find them in Church Slavonic. Go and embrace them as yours. And when we actually get organised and we go on pilgrimage, when we go to Glastonbury, with that great mobile Russian picnic that always makes it an absolute joy and a feast of faith in every sense. We go there and we venerate the saints. And for some of us, it's a joy to see how our Slavic parishioners sometimes have more zeal and more love and more enthusiasm for these holy places and these holy people than British people do. Well, if you're one of those, go and teach them, go and tell them, go and shake them, go and wake them up, and actually tell them, we're going on a pilgrimage. Why don't you come with us? Why don't you share this experience and tap into this great holiness? So let the saints tie us together and lead us forward together in faith and in love. Amen.